So, thank you so much for joining us today at Servcorp's lovely offices. How are you doing today?
Good, very good. Cannot complain at all.
So, we're about a year out from your big acquisition. We'll kind of cover everything. But how has the last 12 months been for you?
The last 12 months have been a bit of like a mental roller coaster. I think lots of people who sell their companies basically say like they then felt quite sad. I didn't feel sad, but I did feel this sense of after we signed the deal, I remember the next day I just went to Gymbox and then I went to Sainsbury's and I was just like, my whole life has changed, but everything else is very normal. And that's always a bit of a mental kind of, I guess, shift that you have to go through to be like, oh, actually my whole life has changed, but the world keeps going on and you have to almost like adapt to that rather than the world like adapting to you. So that was fun. Did some good trips, went to Bali, fell in love with elephants. And actually in about 6 weeks, I'm going to the Serengeti. So I discovered my love for travel. So it's been good.
That's always good. So has that been your lavish spend, or have you done any other?
My lavish spend. Do you know what? I'm not like a super lavish person, which is I guess to some degree quite good, because if I was, oh my God, I'd be going nuts. But yeah, I think the Bali trip was probably the most lavish one. That was like 30 grand trip, like first class flights, like everything. I was like, you know what? This was much deserved, rather than I don't know, buying a Rolex or something like that. Yeah,
no, absolutely. So for people who don't necessarily know your story, I know it's difficult to kind of boil down, 10 odd years into a short soundbite, but could you just give us a bit of an overview of your career, if that's all right?
My career, okay, so first company, so I've always kind of done entrepreneurial things. My plan initially was to become a journalist when I was a kid, and then I decided that I didn't want to do that anymore. So got really into business quite young. 14 was when I started my first interesting thing, my first money-making thing, a tutoring company. 17, I then started a company called Entrepreneur Express, which was like an online media publication. I guess to some degree quite similar to Business Leader. I was fortunate enough to get into the whole like Facebook groups and Facebook world. This was 11 years ago when like, Facebook pages were just rampant. Like you could just grow them. So I grew a bunch of pages through that, use that as traffic to distribute the publication, and I was fortunate enough for that to be like my first ever like major win. So I sold that to a company called Horizon Media in America, and that wasn't huge. It was like 110 grand, but like for a 17-year-old, like for something that he'd been working on for 11 months, selling for 110 grand, I was like, whoa. Like this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, basically. And then after that, in my second year of university, started Fanbytes, which I guess like was the big win, which was all around helping brands to tap into a Gen Z audience, scaled that from like 0 to 75 people, and then we sold it last year. So it's been kind of like an iterative step of discovering stuff, realizing that I'm good at it, iterating on it further, and then growing and growing from there.
I think, even talking at, that first business you started at 14, that's quite a big entrepreneurial kind of step to take.
Yeah.
Did you have any kind of blueprint when you were growing up that was like, this is the kind of person I want to emulate, or was it very much kind of self-taught at that stage?
So I don't think I had any specific person I wanted to emulate. I think it was a specific type of lifestyle. So I've said it before, but when I was around, like when I started the thing at 14, I didn't know I was starting like a business. It was just a tutoring thing. I was good at maths. I tutored people maths. That's kind of it. At 17, I discovered this website called Retire at 21. And I remember reading stories of young entrepreneurs who were starting companies. They covered people like Pete Cashmore, who was the founder of Mashable, these 20-year-olds building companies before 30. I was like, wow, this is crazy. And so I don't think it was a specific person. I think it was more, there was just lifestyle that I thought, like, me as a kid who grew up on like a council estate in southeast London, I was like, wow, this is a new world which I can get involved in. And that was really what it was. There's this whole kind of thing, right, about, I think it was like Tony Robbins who said it, but basically like people are either pushed away from something or like pulled towards something. So you're either pulled towards an idea of what you could be or being pushed away of something that you don't want. And I think at the beginning, I was very much like, I was pushing away from where I lived, where I felt I was kind of unfairly living there, right? And then I then began to be like pulled towards what could be possible from a business perspective. So that's kind of the transition of mindset and beliefs that really helped me.
Yeah. And then again, coming back to Entrepreneur Express, thank goodness you didn't stick around with it. I'd be scared for my job. But I just want to take you back to that, like 17, someone, like you mentioned, from America just emails you and goes like, you know, I want to talk to you about the company. And then I want to acquire the company.
Crazy.
I mean, that's mental. Like how did that feel? Like, can you go back to that? And obviously you've got context now with Fanbytes, but that must have been a crazy moment for you.
Yeah, I mean, so the whole idea of Entrepreneur Express when we began it was like pretty much a business media publication. Let's interview cool people, let's understand business from people who've done it before, and then let's put it into a publication that people care about. And similar to you guys, like we had an online and an offline version, but the offline version completely flopped because at that age, I didn't understand like the mechanics of building a print publication. It's like, you can't just call up people a week before and say, do you want to buy ads, right? Like this is something that has to be pre-planned. So the offline version tanked. And then the online version was what I spent all my time on. And to be honest, I think I started it, and when I started discovering this hack of basically being able to grow big Facebook pages, right? So the way I drove traffic to it was I'd grow pages around, you know, Gary Vee, Tony Robbins, Les Dennis, right? Like inspirational, motivational stuff. And I would drive people from there to the site. And it was very much a case of, well, I have a vehicle that's just doing well. It's like I write stuff, then I put it in the pages, and then that then brings people over. And that was going quite well. The acquisition for me was very much a thing of, I didn't expect it, but I expected it. So what I mean by that is when I got this email from this person who was like, can we partner up? And in my whole idea of partnering up, I thought it was, well, I've got this magazine, I've got this publication, you've also got your own publication, so maybe let's like swap articles or something like that. And then he asked me to send over my stats. And when he asked me to send over my stats, the thing which I wouldn't do now, because now I would have thought about it more, but I genuinely sent him everything for a guy who I hadn't met ever before. He could have been a fraud, he could have been anything. I was like, all right, well, here are my page view stats, here are the Facebook pages that I use, here are all that stuff. And then and I'm pretty sure that I also sent an email which said, oh, by the way, I'm still in sixth form. And so if this required coming over to America, I can't do it. Just something like that. And then when we began the conversation and he said, hey, actually, I've been looking at the numbers, rather than partnering up, we'd like to buy you. And in my mind, I was just like, holy shit. Like, I can't believe that I built something that is of value that quickly, that fast. Because it's only been 11 months, like very short time period. And I remember just in my mind thinking, wow, this feels like magic, right? This feels like I'm creating something and from my own brain, and it's come out into the world, and someone has now said, I would like to buy this from you. So my immediate thought was very much kind of like, wow, this is what I want to spend the rest of my life doing. And then when we then were going through the process, one thing that I haven't ever said was like, going through the process, I always thought it was a dream. I was convinced that like this guy somehow was some kind of, I was like, okay, so you want to pay for this? Okay, fine. Are you sure? Are you very sure? But what I would say that was like really good about the acquisition was like, it taught me about being able to just invent things, but it really taught me about the kind of power of distribution, because Horizon Media now is quite a big agency, but at the beginning their whole thing was they wanted to buy like niche media publications and effectively build kind of like a Condé Nast type thing. And they really cared about the Facebook pages. And I went, that's interesting. Like, that's actually what they cared about. So there's something to be said for like, if that hadn't been successful, if we hadn't had that acquisition, I probably would not have thought about Fanbytes, because that set me on this path of, wow, social is the thing that they cared about. How much further can we actually push it?
Yeah, we'll come into Fanbytes a little bit more in a second, but I want to get a little bit hypothetical almost. Like when I think back to the last few people we've chatted to, obviously John Caldwell really hit the perfect moment in time when phones started becoming a bigger thing. Before that, we were talking to Casper Lee, who's obviously YouTuber, exactly as things were coming up. So obviously for yourself, social revolution was happening. Social media was becoming a really big thing. Obviously, you know, young people were absolutely nailing the algorithms and stuff like that to get it perfectly right. If you think that social media didn't happen, do you think you would have still found something to give you the success that you have today?
Do I think I still would have found something? Yes. Do I think I would have found it as easily? No. So I think because I grew up with social media, it just became very innate and very organic to me. What, in an alternative world, what would have happened is I would have maybe gone out to try and find something which I could be quite good at, which I could be above average at, and then built a business around it. But it's almost like, because, as you call it, the like social revolution, because of that, it was almost, it came to find me, right? In the same way, there's a lot of people right now, a lot of young people right now who are building businesses just off TikTok, right? And it's because it's almost like, well, this is my world. If I'm going to build a business, these are the tools that I actively have. So yes, I would have found an edge, but I think it would have been something a bit more proactive rather than a bit more native, which is what kind of being part of the social revolution was.
Yeah, no, that's it. I mean, there's always that thought or that theory that people have where if you took away everything from Elon Musk, he'd be back very, very soon because he'd know how to do it. And that kind of stuff. So that's really interesting. And obviously we come into Fanbytes now on the journey, and just give us a little bit of an idea about the scale. Obviously we mentioned the acquisition already, but we'll go into that a little bit. But just give us some kind of idea of growth and kind of headcount when you were growing the business.
Yeah, so started second year of university. I then recruited my co-founder, Ambrose Cook, and then we brought on a CTO, Mitchell, as well. And I think we were all in different universities, right? So I went to Warwick, Ambrose went to Imperial, Mitchell went to Nottingham. And the whole idea was, you know, to help brands reach that Gen Z audience. And I'd say that we had some very interesting points of scale. So for the first year in 2017, I think the max that we got the company to was like 5 people. 2018, then probably about 15. And then 2019-20 is where we really hit our stride. I think actually in 2020, the team doubled and was probably about 60 people by then. So by the time that we saw the company, was about 75 people based in the UK, 8 figures in revenue. So we did tens of millions of revenue. And then we also then saw the company for tens of millions as well. And it was a very interesting journey, because I remember that I actually spoke to a VC who wanted to fund us. And I actively said no. And the reason I said no, he was a bit shocked, but because I guess no one actually says no to VCs, right? But I said no. I think he wanted to invest something like his fund would invest 8 million. I believe it was like a 65 million pre-money. So post-money, the business would have been worth like 70 million or something. And I said no. And the reason why was because I had a very clear idea of what the exit could be for Fanbytes. And I knew it wouldn't be hundreds of millions. But I was, pretty confident that it'd be in like the mid 8-figure range, because I thought, do you know what? The market is here. We're definitely going to be able to achieve this amount of revenue. If we're also then able to achieve this general amount of market penetration, then we can definitely hit the mark there. And that's something that I didn't realize was actually very uncommon amongst entrepreneurs. I think a lot of entrepreneurs start their company and they'll basically take money from anyone. And even worse, they will play a game where someone else has made the rules. So they'll be like, oh, well, I have this business. We have to go for a seed round. Then we have to go for a Series A. And then, well, obviously we have to go for Series B. It's like, well, no, you don't, right? What is the outcome that you actively want? And I think for me, it was very much like, well, the outcome that I want for this business is we're going to grow it, and in between 5 to 7 years, we're going to scale it up. And then when the market is ready for consolidation, we're then going to sell the company. And it's not going to be 100 million, but it's like comfortably going to be tens of millions. And that's exactly what happened there. And, now with a lot of entrepreneurs, I spend a lot of time basically telling them like almost like be a lot more realistic. Like don't try and play a completely different game. Try and play a game that you want to win rather than others want you to win.
No, absolutely. And, the funding thing is so interesting because we're in a world now where these tech valuations are just crazy. And, the world of funding is going through quite a seismic change. I feel like it's almost like a bit of a bubble that seems to be coming down, especially in the hard times of the potential recession coming. One of the interesting things that I kind of noted in the research on you is that you actively chose to only go for angel investors. Now, that was a very interesting thing to read because some people may not even do that much research into that kind of funding. It, like you said, it's just Series A, B, tick the boxes. But where did that kind of thought come from? Is that something that was very premeditated, or did you get to the time where you were sitting in front of a VC and went like, this is actually ridiculous?
I think it was completely premeditated. I think I knew specifically, I was like, well, we need to get to this amount of revenue in order to achieve this sort of exit value. How much do we actually need to do that? And then just working backwards. So in all, I think we raised about 2 million for the business, and it was all angels. And, people putting in 100 grand, 50 grand, 250 grand, and just that. The other thing is also, I had heard nightmare stories about founders who had raised VC money and had basically had something called like liquidation preferences. So what that means is like, even if they sold the company for whatever amount, the VCs and those guys get paid first before them. So they would have a preference above the founder. And I think from an ego perspective, I didn't like the idea of, I've come up with the idea, I'm doing the hard yards, I'm doing the work, but like there is even a slight potential that you who just chills and just gives out cash would basically be in a more privileged position than me. And I think part of it was very much like, A, this doesn't make any business sense, but also my ego wouldn't let me do it. And then also I think from an angel perspective, especially if you're building maybe like your first real significant company, one of the big competitive advantage you can have is the experience and help from other people. And VCs are generally not known to be people who, you can just text at any time and just say, hey, I've got this problem, can you help me out? Whereas with so many of the angels that we worked with, you know, it could be 2 a.m. and I'm thinking about something and I just shoot them a voice note and they will reply and just say, yeah, you know, do this, or like, this is how I've thought about it. So I think it was a combination of understanding the type of experience and value that I needed, and then also a more long-term game of, well, this is the type of business I want to build. How much funding do we need? And then a bit of like, well, if I'm doing the work, I want to reap the rewards. I don't want someone else to be able to reap the rewards before me.
And as far as the exit, when did that kind of come into your mind in the Fanbytes journey? Was that something that was quite early on that you kind of built it to exit, or was it something that a bit of a light bulb moment for you during the journey?
So I think Fanbytes was always built to have some kind of exit. And there were a few frameworks that I used. The first framework was, I just believe that there are basically 4 outcomes for any business, right? It's either the business fails, it's either you pass it on to your kids, it's either you take it public or you sell the company, right? Like, those are by and large the only 4 things. Fanbytes was not going to fail. And it's also, you know, I started when I was 21. I had no kids. I still have no kids. So I like to pass it on to nobody. It wasn't the sort of company that could go public given the time frame. So the only thing was to achieve some kind of exit. I also think that a second part of it was like, I basically, when I started it, I had written a note to myself, which is basically, all right, by the time I'm 30, whether it's Fanbytes or whether it's some other company, by the time I'm 30, I want to have sold a company and basically like be financially set and like have more money than I know what to do with. And I actually told my co-founder this and we were very agreed on that. So it was very much a kind of, we're doing this and by 30, this needs to happen, right? Now we did it at 27, which is nice, but there was also this whole idea of, there was no other possible alternative. It was like, we said we'll do this by 30, so it kind of has to happen. And that even goes down to the choice of business that you pick, right? So we picked an industry which was nascent, but was growing. And my whole theory was, well, there's going to be a time in this industry where there's going to be consolidation. And that is very, very important. Too many entrepreneurs basically like pick a business with no inherent exit value. So we picked a business where we were like, okay, we saw this in radio, we saw this in TV. Basically what happens is you have like a specialist TV company, a specialist radio company. And then in like 5 to 10 years, some private equity people come in and basically say, we want to roll everything up and we want everything to be integrated. That is going to happen with the influencer world. And so all we basically have to do is ensure that we basically get in the game, stay in the game, and do not die, right? And that's something that I've said to, that's something that I've said on quite a few interviews where like, you can get very far if all you basically tell yourself is like, do not die, right? If you don't die through lack of funding or co-founder disputes, you are always in with a shout. And so that was really like, those were some of the frameworks that we basically used. We're like, right, this is a market that is going to be consolidated. We have a goal by 30. And also this is the most logical conclusion out of all the possible things that a company could do. And that was how we then came to the idea, you know, when we got approached quite a bit to sell the company, it was like, oh, wow, okay, consolidation is happening. We are before 30, and we said that there'll be some kind of exit.
As you mentioned, Brainlabs was the company that you ended up selling the business to. As far as finding a suitor for that exit, how was that a process? Did you get approached earlier and say no to people? Just give us a bit more of an idea of that.
Yeah, so I can run through that. So we sold the company in the 3rd of May, 2022. But actually in 2021, in October, we'd been approached by 3 different companies in 6 weeks. And anytime that happens, that is basically a signal from the market telling you there is some sort of consolidation. And I am absolutely baffled at like the number of entrepreneurs who don't open themselves up to that sort of conversation. So the fact that we had 3 companies in such a short space of time, I thought, wow, right, okay, now it's time. I'm pretty sure that I actually sent a text to my co-founder. I just said, it's time. and he knew exactly what I was talking about. And so then we said, right, we are then gonna appoint a bank because for the size of our transaction, it was very important that we had someone who has, done it before, or some company who had done it before. So we appointed a bank and we run a process with them. And we appointed them by November. Yeah, by November. December was kind of quiet, but everything came roaring back in January. And we met a bunch of potential buyers. All we did was meet 6, I believe. So actually quite a small number. And then 4 of them put in, 4 of them were quite keen. And then 3 of them put in letters of intent, which is basically, we've met them, we vibed with them, and then they say like, this is what a deal could look like. Then we went into due diligence. I think when I first met Brainlabs, I was actually thinking, right, okay, this could actually make a lot of sense because they're very good at like performance marketing, very much like PPC, paid social, but that brand and content side they didn't have. And so I think we had someone else who we thought would be a better fit until I then met Brainlabs. And I would feel, oh, okay, right. This actually makes a lot more sense. And a big part of it is also, a lot of founders wouldn't acknowledge this. But I think there's also something quite cool, especially if you work in like a niche industry, to sell to a company which is also respected in that industry. So being able to say, like Fanbytes was acquired by Brainlabs, and people go, oh, Brainlabs. Like there is some element of there's a halo effect. And so that was a whole process from October to, basically about like April. And then we announced in May, from the time that we were approached, appointed a bank, and then all the way up to the time that we then announced the deal. And
I want to kind of go back to that, and almost it's a little bit analogous to like an athlete who's retiring. Was there a moment, because I mean, you've built this company for years, you've been around the same people for years, and now suddenly your past doesn't work to get in the building kind of thing. So did you have a moment where it was like, oh, this is actually pretty crazy? I know obviously the money's an upside, but was there a moment where it was like, wow, this is actually happening? And even though you knew it was coming, were you kind of prepared for that?
The 2 stories that I've told before, and I'm sure some people may have heard before, but I'll share a few. I think the crazy moments. The first crazy moment was when we officially signed everything, because there is actually quite a big, maybe 2 weeks or so when you've like signed the deal, but the money hasn't dropped. And there's this kind of weird limbo stage where you're like, I signed it. This is done. And it's going to happen. But it just still feels unreal. And so when we signed the deal, it was, I don't know why, but deals always seem to be kept quite late. And so we were just up until like Friday, 2 a.m., just signing docs. And because it was, Friday, 2 a.m., it was all done virtually. And then when the final doc came in to sign, I got on a Zoom with me, Mitchell Ambrose, and basically I had this like video recording where I'd like rehearsed a speech in my mind, like, guys, I'm so proud of you. But I was like, my brain was so frazzled as to like, oh my God, it's happening. I think that I started off with like, guys, I'm so proud. And then I just said a bunch of words. This is blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh, this is so great. It's amazing. We signed it. And then I had to do the final signature. And the crazy thing is that you sign it off, and then you just get a thing pop up in Gmail saying like all parties have signed. and you just go, wow, like that was it. That was all the years and the heartache and the stress and all that stuff that we put in has culminated in this moment. That was a very, very crazy experience. The second one is one I've said quite a few times before, but like when the money actually dropped, Mitchell and Ambrose were on different banks to me. I had actually opened up a bank account specifically for this transaction, and we were just walking around trying to find, trying to wait basically for the money to come in, and we just kept checking, kept like scrolling up and refreshing, and nothing was showing. And then what then happened was Ambrose checked, and then he just was shouting. He was like, oh my God. And then Mitchell also checked. He was like, oh my God, like just shouting. And then I checked, but because I was on a different bank, I checked and it still showed 0. And I was like, what's going on? And then I had to just keep refreshing. And then I checked, and then like suddenly it was like more money than I've seen like ever in my life. And I was like, oh my God, like this is crazy. And I remember just like shouting. Like that's all I did. Just like, oh my God, just like I kept shouting. So those two were quite surreal moments. I'd say the final moment was actually when I stood in front of the company and I said that we'd sold the company. I think a lot of people who had come to work at Fanbytes, in fact, I say a lot, like pretty much everyone was really happy. And that made me happy because it made me feel good as to the fact that I felt like we had done something good, we had done something positive, we had chosen the right partner. And I think I would have felt maybe slightly different if I had known almost I had like quote unquote sold out, to some crappy person who, to some crappy company that I thought there was no way this was a fit. So those 3 moments were pretty crazy. But I think that, and we're talking about this before, I think for most entrepreneurs, the disconnect is basically when the day after a transaction or anything like that, and like the world just keeps going around, but your world has completely changed. And I was speaking to a friend and he said it's actually quite similar to if you had a family member who passed away. It's like your entire world has changed, but everyone is just going about their own way. And you just go, why hasn't the world stopped? And I think I had that feeling probably for like the first 3 months. And I think that there was a part of me, I probably shouldn't say this, but whatever. There was a part of me where like I'd go to supermarkets or things like that, and like I would feel this sense of like, guys, I'm fucking rich. Like, guys, look, like just look at me, right? Like, because it just felt so crazy to think that there was such a disconnect. But like learn to live with that, learn to grow with that. But yeah, those were like three moments where it just felt so crazy that this was actively happening. And yeah, I think most entrepreneurs who achieve some kind of transaction, achieve some kind of sale, probably go through that exact same thing as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's one thing that you do very well now, but you did very well when you were at Fanbytes, and that's definitely develop a personal brand.
Yeah.
How important was that to kind of put yourself out there and be a little bit more visible? Kind of whether that's kind of post-sale, that's something that you're looking at, but how kind of calculated was that?
So when I was running Fanbytes, because we were quite early in like the influencer game, a lot of people just didn't quite understand it. In fact, if you look at a lot of the articles of influencers in 2017, it was always like, these kids in their bedrooms, just like shooting videos, they're weird, And so like, because there was always this lack of understanding, you needed to almost be someone who could, how do I call it? take the bullets, right? So you needed to be someone who could go out into the front line and talk about, actually, this is why this is important. These are the strengths of using these influencers. This is how the market is evolving. And that would not have happened if you didn't like create a personal brand around it. Otherwise, it would have just been very much hey, we're Fanbytes, we do this thing. But if the person is not convinced, if the person is not persuaded as to the merit of the whole influencer thing in general, they're not going to use Fanbytes anyway, or anyone. And so actually, you know, for the first 2 years, it was a very calculated thing, which was this industry needs thought leaders, and I'm happy to be that person. And then over time, when I started to realize, wow, you know, from a business perspective, this is also doing very well in terms of like driving more customers, doing all that stuff. I mean, one very interesting fact is, you know, by the time we sold the company, you know, like 8 figures in revenue, we actually only had about 3% of that coming from outbound. So like us going out to people. So much of it was like people coming over to us because we had spent years and years and years compounding and building thought leadership through content marketing and all of that. So at the beginning, it was more like, people don't understand this industry. We are here to be able to be that thought leader. And then it kind of became a competitive advantage. And then it then became second nature to do that, which is why even post-sale, things like creating content is just second nature, because we've done it for so long, and I've done it for so long before Fanbytes. I think building a personal brand now, for anyone, regardless of whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you work in a company as a team member, is incredibly, incredibly critical. You cannot not have one. Because in a world where we're all like interacting through the screens, it's not so much what you know, it's more like who knows you, right? So it's not so much like what you know or who you know, it's like who knows you. Because if an opportunity comes up and I'm thinking, you know, who can I help or who can I bring in, I would just like instantly almost just go in my mind and think, who in my mind seems to know about this stuff? And then I'd go to that person, even if they may not be the best person. There is people always say stuff like the best product wins. And I think that is like the biggest pile of bullshit ever. I think the idea of the best product wins is a very idealistic thing. Actually, it's the best marketed product. And so, like, hand on heart, I can say Fanbytes built a very great product, our technology, our process, but it wasn't like the best from a hardcore perspective, right? Some people build these like, you know, some people introduce machine learning and recommendation software into their thing, but we absolutely swept the floor with them because we cared a lot more about marketing and distribution rather than like building the best product you could ever hope for.
One thing that was quite key when you were building Fanbytes was kind of creating your own technology to go with that and building your own systems. Why did you find that so important?
So I think I found it important for 2 reasons. The first one was that I knew that generally when you start a services business, if you then were to come to sell it, it would be valued on a multiple of EBIT, net profit and stuff. And I knew that actually for us to really achieve the outcome we wanted, it made more sense for it to be more on revenue. And more importantly, even before that, is I just thought about the scale of the opportunity that we wanted to be able to hit. And if we wanted to achieve that scale solely through people, you know, we'd probably have had to hire double the people that we wanted, right? You know, so from 75 to like 150 people. And I just didn't want the headache. And so technology was our way of basically being able to scale without scaling our people. A very fun fact actually is by the time the company was acquired, 40% of our revenue was coming from the US, but we didn't have a single person there. And it was because we were using technology to be able to scale and to be able to deliver there.
And you know, even when you were talking there, there's a certain level of like disruption.
Yeah.
Because, you know, essentially it was an industry that didn't really exist.
Yeah.
And, you know, you had to come in and kind of almost educate people. And I'm just curious, as someone who was, you know, 22, 23,
yeah,
even 21 when you first started the business, how did people kind of, when you went into rooms to talk to them, how did they kind of, was there a level of like, who's this young kid coming in and talking to us, or were people quite receptive to that kind of approach?
So I think people would always treat you how you treat yourself. So if you treat yourself with an air of confidence and maturity and sturdiness, people would go, well, this person knows what they're talking about. They seem unflappable in the way that they talk, so it must be right, you know? And so I don't think there was ever anyone or any feeling of, well, they don't know what they're talking about. I think it's more, he is so unshakable in the way that he thinks this is the future. Well, I guess it must be, right? And that was definitely a competitive edge in like the first year or so. And then once you build some good case studies and stuff, then you can reference case studies. And then by that time, the business is kind of humming along by itself. But I definitely think that at the beginning, if it wasn't going in and saying, well, like, this is the future, like, your business is going to be disrupted by this, or your marketing is going to be disrupted by this. Gen Z are not paying attention to your TV ads, your radio ads, like all of this other stuff. They're focusing on these new influencers. And here is the data, and I'm so sure of it, I've built a complete business around it. You go, well, I mean, it must be true, right? And so I definitely believe in this also of like, people will treat you how you treat yourself. And because I treated myself, or I treated the company as like a very strong, dominant person, that's the way that it worked.
So again, keeping on that disruption theme,
and
you know, you've mentioned about the angel investors, and you know that there is a VC issue. Is there any part of you now that you've exited that you kind of go like, maybe I want to try and improve VC? Is that something that you've thought about?
No. I have no intentions of doing that, because I think a big part of the reason why people go the whole VC route is, again, it's just a status game, right? Like, people want to work with name brand VCs because they think that's what equates success, and it probably comes from school, right? Like, people want to go to Oxbridge because they want the name Oxbridge. People want to go to specific banks to work at because they want that name. So even as an entrepreneur, sometimes you are very interested in just playing the status game rather than the financial games. That was something that I always kind of was very wary of. Like, don't play the status game, because you could go down the path of then getting a huge office. Why? Because you want to have a huge office. You can go down the path of you raise money, and it's like, in fact, one thing that absolutely pisses me off is when I read something about someone who's raised money and they say, all right, we've raised this amount. We are 35 people and our aim is then to get to 100 people by the end of the year. It's like, why? I thought you got into this to like make profit and then, you know, potentially sell. But it's like, yay, we've now raised money to now triple our costs. Woo! It's such a silly way of thinking about business. And I think more people should actually think the inverse of that. What makes more sense rather than what makes sense for others. And
we've already touched on the kind of tech funding bubble that's kind of happening at the moment. Where do you kind of see this ending? Do you think it's naturally just going to kind of be a bubble and suddenly people are going to have less money to pump into stuff, or how do you see this ending?
Yeah, I mean, this thing always goes in market cycles, right? Because human beings are irrational creatures, and from when in 2020 people were selling pictures of a rock for like 2 million, and they said it's the new age of ownership. It's like, no, it is bullshit, and it is, and you are convincing yourself of it. So this is what's going to happen. There'll be some, you know, we're in a recession, we're going into a recession, blah, blah. Things will tighten, blah, blah, blah. It will then happen for about 3 years. And then in 3 to 5 years, people will say it's a new paradigm, and then the same thing will happen again. That's just the game that we're in. It happened in 2008, and then it happened in, it's happening now. It will just keep happening and happening. So unfortunately, you can't change the way human beings operate.
So you mentioned earlier about the importance of technology, and obviously now that you're out and you've exited the business, was there any kind of technology that is intriguing you? I'm sure you get pictures all the time with various coins and all kinds of stuff, but as far as like blockchain and things like that, is there any kind of technology that you're interested in?
I mean, the most obvious one, and the one people are talking about right now, is, ChatGPT and generative AI and all of that. I think ChatGPT definitely has some substance in it. I think LLMs and all those are just ways to do what people are currently doing, but do it faster and do it at scale. And anything that enables you to do that, there is definitely some substance in there. I remember 2-3 years ago when, NFTs and all of that. And I just kept telling people this Web3 thing is just absolute bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. And the whole thing was, people want to take ownership of their data and all that stuff. And my whole thing of that was, if it cannot be applied to, Tom who lives in Hartlepool, then this is not going to be something that really changes. Like, Tom from Hartlepool does not give a crap who owns his data. He just wants to have a nice life, get on with his day, nice family, get a job done, right? And so if technology can help him to achieve that, that's great. If it's just some kind of, this is what the world should be like, of ownership and idealism, then it doesn't make any sense. So ChatGPT, LLMs, that's quite interesting. Web3, the whole space, to me was just a bunch of smoke and mirrors, basically.
And as we mentioned, you have exited now. I'm going to save you answering the obvious question of what's next, but are you putting pressure on yourself for something, or are you quite chilled about what you're going to do next? So
if we'd been having this conversation shortly after the acquisition, the answer would have been very different. The answer would have been, yes, I am putting a lot of pressure on myself. But, when we sold the company, there was still some work to be done in terms of integrating the companies, integrating Fanbytes inside of Brainlabs, which actually did keep me quite busy. And so I think it was a very important kind of transition period where I didn't feel the need to just dive directly into something else. And so now, am I putting pressure on myself? No. And I think it is because I am being a lot more choosy about the circumstances to build the next company. Probably the biggest thing is being choosy around the people. We were saying earlier, I think off camera, was when I was younger or just earlier in the game, I would learn and I would read a lot of successful people talking about how they build their companies, etc. And they'd always say stuff about it's all about the people. And I'd always think it's just absolute crap, right? I'd be like, no, just, like tell me what sales and marketing thing that you did. Don't just say it's all about the people or some kind of humble brag that you're doing. But I have come to realize, especially after the experience with Fanbytes, that it really is all about the people. Like, people are indeed your competitive advantage. And so I'm spending a lot more time getting the conditions right by spending more time with the type of people I would want to start a business with at some point. The type of people who give me energy, the type of people who I can learn from, those type of people. And that is perhaps what I'm spending the most amount of time on. It's not so much the idea, because I think once you have the right people, and you pick generally a decent market, like things happen. But you could pick a great market, and if the people are not the ones that you want to spend time with, that are not the right fit, then I've seen it so many times where it absolutely fails.
It's now time for a very, very special segment. We've teamed up with the Jill Dando News Centre to bring you the Good News Postcard. And your question today comes from Grace, age 11.
Hi, my name is Grace from Jill Dando News Centre at Castlebatch Primary School Academy. Jill Dando valued positivity. What's your favourite characteristic and why?
Hi Grace, thanks for your question. My favorite characteristic in people is accountability. So people who actually own up to things they're going to do and then they do it. Because there's a lot of people who say they will do things and they don't do it, and you want to stay away from those people.
That is a great question and a brilliant answer. So my final question for you, obviously we are business leaders. So what would you say makes a great business leader?
One is self-awareness, being able to know your strengths and your weaknesses and not being afraid to double down on your strengths rather than aiming to be an all-rounder. If you look at a lot of the best business leaders in the world, they are good at a few things and they just zone in and focus on that. Second one is somewhat linked, which is humility. And by humility, I actually don't mean like be mad humble, right? Because I actually think that most really successful people have a superiority complex. Like they think that they are better, they think they can be better. But I think it's also just being radically aware of the fact that you don't know everything. And, you know, for example, for me, I've said several times that a big part of my success I can attribute to the fact that I'm aware I don't know a lot of things. And so I just like rigorously learn and study and read about skills and attributes that I want to embody. And then the third would be actually what we spoke about earlier, which was accountability. I think being able to do what you say you will do and being able to hold yourself to a higher standard, which doesn't need someone else to hold you to that standard, is so rare nowadays. A lot of us who came in from the school system were told what to do and how to think. And so because of that, a lot, you know, there's a phrase on Twitter called NPCs. What is NPCs?
Non-playable characters.
Yeah.
I've got kids, so.
Oh, there you go, right? Yeah. And it's so easy to be an NPC nowadays because you just kind of are told what to do and you say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. And I'm not saying it from like an entrepreneur perspective, like whether you work in teams as an employee, etc., being able to have like a self-accountability of holding yourself to a standard, doing what you say you will do without someone having to follow up on you, without someone having to tell you, is a massive competitive advantage. So those three things, like self-awareness, humility, and accountability are the three things that I really value in business leaders.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely brilliant advice for sure. And do you have any kind of final words for our audience today?
Maybe one of the biggest pieces of advice that I wish I'd had earlier is when you're running a business, you tend to think like, if this business was not to work out the way you'd want to, like everything would be lost. And I think a very important thing is to not see your business as your baby. That is something a lot of people talk about, you know, this business, my baby. And I always go, well, two things. The first one is, if it was your baby, at some point the baby's got to grow up, right? So like, you've got to be able to let it fly. And then the second thing is, you are not your business and your business is not you. So like really have a healthy detachment from your business, because that would help you to make much better decisions. And so many entrepreneurs are very good at solving other people's problems and not their own problems, because they're so immersed in it that they are not able to see reality from opinion. And so being able to detach yourself from your business, see it as something that serves you rather than you serving it, especially if you're going through the scaling phase, is probably the biggest mindset shift that I can give to any entrepreneur.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a brilliant way to leave it. Thank you so much, Timo. And where can people kind of follow your journey as you take your next step, shall we say?
Take my next step. Well, I'm quite visible. So Instagram, LinkedIn, everywhere. Just search my name, you'll see me. But Instagram and LinkedIn is where I share a lot of my thoughts on it.